Popularity is fleeting. Just ask any band or musician who's had a one-hit wonder, or a developer who's only ever made one really popular game. Hey, for a long time, I think it still is, my most popular videos are all about Easter eggs. That was before I learned how clickbait works. I'll teach you one day.
There's a difference between underrated obscure video games and ones that have lost popularity over time. If you're actively looking for obscure video games, you'll find some fairly bizarre specimens that maybe Japan was hiding behind lack of localization, but personally I find it more interesting when popular video games fall from their lofty perches and disappear as a footnote to something greater. It is hard to keep up with current trends, everyone does so much shouting these days. How do popular games become obscure, I hear you ask? Fine question, voice in my head. Lack of support generally. What was once an exciting, bustling franchise has its day in the sun but loses relevance as time goes by. Some games are able to cling on due to a committed fan base, but these are usually the exception that proves the rule, that without people speedrunning or hacking, these games get forgotten. That's kinda sad, really. Here's a funny picture of a duck. Before I started making videos on YouTube, I remember seeing this article somewhere that was talking about video games that aren't really video games. Makes more sense now we've got Steam Greenlight pumping out weird simulators and cryptic adventure games where you spend most of the time walking around somewhat aimlessly, but at the time when I read the article, I must have been 13 or 14, those kind of games weren't as rife as they are now. Instead, the article brought up Myst, which I had sort of heard about before, but I didn't know it was a point-and-click 3D adventure that helped to promote the use of CD-ROMs for gaming and was the best-selling PC game until The Sims came along. So, what happened?
It took me a while to get into PC gaming. You know, I grew up with Nintendo consoles and I did my stint with Roller Coaster Tycoon, but apart from that, I generally steered away from it. Does that mean that I can't show appreciation for the impact that Myst had on an industry? Nah, I can do that. Steam hasn't been around since the dawn of civilization, you know?
When you think about it, Myst is one of the most important games of all time. For 1993, being able to make an immersive environment with little conventional gameplay that turns out to be one of the most commercially successful of all time, you know, that's pretty impressive. The problem is that with changing tastes in video games, and indeed what video games should be, Myst has aged horribly. Do you want to explore an expansive world like in Skyrim, or do you want to watch a slideshow with the occasional puzzle? It's a bit of a hard sell. Of course, there are a few sequels, and from the looks of it, the quality never dipped too far, but by 2005 the world had moved on and developer Cyan folded due to financial difficulties shortly after Myst 5 came out. Did you know that Myst has ports on mobile devices and the 3DS? Neither did I. Turns out they're kind of terrible. Aged like an egg in the sun. It's impossible to tell which franchise will stand up well against the test of time. You'd think consistency, right? Both in terms of quality of games and the time between each entry, but if something comes along that completely redefines the genre, then you're shit out of luck. The rise of the first-person shooter in the mid-2000s came as a signal to gaming execs to pump as much money as possible into it, which helped it to become one of the ages of gaming, as I'll call it. Sounds grand, I like it. But if you make such massive changes to a genre, you tend to leave established franchises behind. At the peak of Quake's popularity in the late 90s, you wouldn't have thought that there would be a period in time when the world wasn't enamored with one of the founding fathers of first-person shooters. You know, you got Doom, GoldenEye, some Wolfenstein. History was kind to all of these, yeah? I mean, it was with Doom, but only because someone made a reboot last year which was beautiful and amazing and shit. But Quake kind of disappeared off the face of the earth. Well, not quite, since it's still very much alive in certain circles, and a portion of long-time fans of shooters can trace their roots back to Quake. But everywhere else, it's a franchise that hasn't been relevant in a long time. Sure, they made more games with the Quake name on the box, but ID Software and others haven't been able to replicate the same level of quality as the first game. You know, they're not horrible, but they're not much better than good enough. That being said, we're getting Quake Champions at some point, maybe later this year, after 10 years of wilderness. Anything that Doom can do, eh?
I mentioned Quake Champions, but apart from the reveal at last year's E3, we haven't heard a lot about it. I guess maybe if you're surrounding yourself with the kind of friends who are really excited about it, you'll hear the news when it comes out. But if the world has forgotten about Quake, then I'd be promoting the game as much as possible. Supposedly, the closed beta starts this week. We'll soon find out how well the world remembers it.
Over time, I've learned to really hate it when a game or a movie is billed as being from the same people that brought you something else that you might have liked. Somehow we've got it in our heads that you can judge the quality of something based on what came before, and yeah, it's kind of helpful, but there's more factors at play than simply some of the staff behind it being the same. You know, trends change, and there's no guarantee that anyone's gonna give a crap based on reputation. It can also breed complacency, almost we don't have to work that hard, people will buy it regardless. Spore wasn't a bad game, but hey, it's from the same mind that brought the world The Sims. If you're not excited for that, then you probably eat a lot of cabbage. Imagine if, after the first Sims game came out in the year 2000, Will Wright was just like, yeah, that'll do. We don't need to maintain momentum or anything and help turn a good game into a great franchise. Not to say that every successful game needs a sequel, but comparing Spore with The Sims, you can see an immediate contrast of how to deal with a game's popularity. Spore's creature-creating, procedurally generated spacefaring adventure gave players plenty to think about, but it lost momentum quickly. There was never a follow-up which made improvements, and instead, fans of Spore have had the same experience for 9 years now. I'll be honest, I can't find much value in any part of Spore that isn't the space stage, which is like No Man's Sky but actually fun. Really, for a game with such promising roots, more should have been done with it. Spore is a game all about the evolution of an organism. It could have done with a bit of evolution itself. You can still make penis monsters though.
I mentioned earlier that the rise of a particular franchise usually comes at the cost of the competitors, but this happens because not every series is so flexible to change. If Call of Duty comes along and changes how people view first-person shooters, and you don't hitch a ride along hoping to leech off some of that success, things won't go well for you.
It's weird to think that Call of Duty wasn't always in the advantageous position it's in these days. Well, Infinite Warfare was underwhelming and the future of the franchise is subject to a fair amount of speculation, but that is nothing compared to what the series went through in the early 2000s. The early Call of Duty games aren't too bad, but the harsh reality is that direct competitors were doing a lot better. Leading the charge was Medal of Honor, a name synonymous with high-quality World War II shooters, and Call of Duty was struggling to keep up. Then a decision was made in 2005 that resulted in the release of Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare, which is a wonderful game that molded the shape of the franchise for years to come. Call of Duty wasn't able to beat Medal of Honor at its own game, so they made a new game. But how did Medal of Honor do by comparison? Badly. It just couldn't keep up. There's been 14 games in the Medal of Honor series, and the first 12 have all focused on a World War II setting. 2010 saw the release of the first game in the franchise made as a direct reaction to Call of Duty's popularity, but by this time Call of Duty had a lot of momentum and was already 3 games deep. Medal of Honor had to play catch up, and while the 2 games they churned out were pretty good and sold well, I think higher-ups decided they were fighting a losing battle. The most critically acclaimed game in the series was the first back in 1999, with the worst game being Medal of Honor Warfighter in 2012, and we haven't seen a game since. The name still carries a bit of resonance if you grew up with the older games, but away from that, Medal of Honor has become surprisingly obscure. Apparently, in the 2008 version of the Gamers Edition of the Guinness World Records, it picked up a world record for the best-selling FPS franchise. Yeah, didn't last long. I lead a relatively simple life, which means that my new favourite website is Steam Charts, which shows the rise and fall of a Steam game's player base. I've been a fan of statistics for as long as I can remember, and I always think that you can tell a story by using graphs like these. Did the release of Overwatch see a decline in the number of people playing Team Fortress 2? Nope, not really. How quickly did people realise that No Man's Sky has very little content? Pretty quickly, actually. Did Umbrella Corps become the esport that Capcom wanted it to be? That's a funny joke, what are you, a comedian? It's a really useful database for a video like this because while it might be easy to see a dead fanbase, it's harder to reference that back with what it was like at its peak. Battleborn had a pretty big dip in player base after its release, but joke's on you, that game was never popular. Evolve was though, even got a 9 from IGN. Must be a good game. and developer Turtle Rock were banking on Evolve's qualities, helping it stay in the thoughts of gamers everywhere. When it was first shown off at E3, it scooped up the awards left, right and centre, and with Turtle Rock being made up of former Valve employees who worked on Left 4 Dead, you can see a path to success that Evolve seemed to be travelling on. It's a great concept for a game. 4 players try to take down one player-controlled monster which can consume wildlife to evolve and become stronger. It's kind of a race against time to take the monster out before it gets too strong, and in theory, that's an exciting idea for a game. Can you get better results by playing hide and seek instead? Yeah, but that's no fun. Shortly after its release, Evolve bombed like you wouldn't believe. All these positive reviews were called into question when players got to grips with a horrendously imbalanced game that lacked the polish or excitement they were being sold. As such, Evolve went from a game that everyone was losing their minds over to one that suffered a severe player base exodus within a week of its release. A free weekend boosted its numbers before Turtle Rock decided to cut their losses in July of last year by making it free to play on PC, a game that cost about $50 at launch. I almost feel bad for it, but then I remind myself that Evolve was promoting a season pass and pre-order bonus before we had seen any gameplay, but also had microtransactions and some of the laziest DLC you'll ever see, including a lot that wasn't covered by the season pass. For that, I reckon it can burn in hell.
This is RabbidLuigi, and Evolve's player base went up by 20,000% when it went free to play, but if Turtle Rock had intended for this to have some kind of lasting effect, it never really happened. Evolve had problems with matchmaking at launch, but you try and get a game now there are 500 people worldwide playing it every month. Turtle Rock have since ended their support of Evolve, so yeah, if this is what the evolution of video games looks like, we might be in a bit of trouble.
Have you got an idea that you'd like me to turn into a countdown? Let me know in a comment down below, and make sure you check out my Twitter, where I'll be turning the best submissions into a poll where you can then decide the best topic. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.